The United States Congress is full of incredibly prolific liars, and the worst of them all has now been arrested and indicted. No, not that one. Not that one either. No, not that one. Yes, that's the one. George Santos is a liar of historical proportions. The Republican representative for New York's 3rd District was recently arrested and indicted on 13 charges, including wire fraud, unlawful monetary transactions, which is a money laundering offense, false statements on House disclosure reports, and theft of public money. Turns out that the guy who was willing to lie about where he went to high school and college, working on Wall Street, founding an animal charity, his mother dying in 9/11, his grandmother being a Holocaust victim, and his history with drag, was also willing to lie about some other things. Now let's get this out of the way right at the top. An indictment is allegations. They are not necessarily true. Prosecutors share evidence with a grand jury related to the charges they want to bring, and then the grand jury decides whether or not that evidence is sufficient for an indictment. If it is, then the indictment is brought, but the accused is still innocent until proven guilty, and Santos will have an opportunity to defend himself in front of a jury of his peers, though presumably significantly more honest peers, unless he ends up pleading guilty. So far, he has pleaded not guilty and has insisted that he will not resign. So just remember as we go through this that the biggest liar in Congress claims that these allegations are completely false. George Santos, who sometimes goes by his middle names, Anthony Devolder, set up a company in Florida called the Devolder Organization that was entirely owned by him. This entity was also one of the 2 authorized managers for an additional Florida corporation that is referred to as Company Number 1 in the indictment. Because I cannot help myself, I spent an hour digging through Florida corporate records to figure out what company this could be, and I believe I have figured it out. There's a company registered at the same address as the Devolder Organization in Merritt Island, Florida, called Redstone Strategies, which has 2 managers, including the Devolder Organization. Matching up with the indictment, this company was formed on November 1st, 2021, which seems to indicate that we found it. Company number 1 is almost certainly Redstone Strategies, so I'm going to say Redstone Strategies for the rest of this video. If you think I'm wrong, then substitute whatever you think Company 1 is when we're talking about that part of the indictment. Cool? Good. The other manager for Redstone Strategies is Jason Benoit and Associates, who also happens to be a member of Red Strategies USA, which also has the Devolder Organization as a member. We're going to get back to Red Strategies USA, don't worry. Both of these organizations, the Devolder Organization and Redstone Strategies, were used in this alleged scheme to misappropriate political contributions. This campaign donation scheme started in the last couple months before the election and involved person number 1, who I have not identified yet, but they do live in Queens, which is where his sister, who headed up his PAC, Rise New York, lives. Fun coincidence. I, of course, am not saying that person number 1 was his sister. I'm just saying if I was forced to take a guess, that's who I would go to first. Person number 1 was directed by Santos to start soliciting donations and directing them towards Redstone Strategies. During this process, they said several lies about Redstone Strategies, including that it was a 501c4 not-for-profit, that it was a super PAC, and that funds were being used to support George Santos's campaign. In reality, funds were actually being misdirected to pay credit card debts, buy designer clothing, and otherwise used for personal benefit of the candidate. The fun thing I realized while writing this script is that George Santos's frauds are almost fun to talk about because they're like the textbook examples. For example, if you ask someone to describe what a textbook example of what misappropriating donor funds might look like, this would be a perfect example. Now, this isn't super relevant, but crypto is my day job, so y'all need to hear this. FTX, the cryptocurrency exchange, which recently failed in spectacular fashion, had several executives who gave generously to George Santos's campaign. 3 different executives all gave the maximum amount to his campaign, including Ryan Salami, the FTX US co-CEO, Claire Watanabe, who was head of brand and people for FTX, and Ramnik Arora, who used to lead product for FTX. I want to make sure that we're all very clear also that the indictment of Sam Bankman-Fried alleges that Ryan Salami specifically was acting, at least for some donations, as a straw man for SBF. So at least some of the support for George Santos came from one of the worst cryptocurrency exchanges to ever exist. It feels appropriate that the biggest liar in Congress, who used to work for a Ponzi, allegedly, ended up funded by a Ponzi, allegedly. Pretend you hear allegedly every time I say Ponzi for the rest of this video, because otherwise I would have to say it a lot. Now about that alleged Ponzi that George Santos worked for. The indictment also identifies investment firm number 1, which, again, they don't disclose, but we can use other broadly reported details about Santos and the timeline to identify it as Harbor City Capital, which is most notable for the SEC accusing it of being a Ponzi scheme. I'm going to discuss Harbor City Capital for the rest of this, and I will occasionally refer to it in places where investment firm number 1 was in the indictment. If you think I am wrong, then substitute whatever investment firm you think George Santos was working for. Santos has maintained that he had no idea that Harbor City Capital was an alleged Ponzi scheme, but you know what? Let's talk about what the Ponzi was before we talk about why I don't believe him. Harbor City Capital sold super high yield bonds. Currently, a 10-year U.S. Treasury yields about 3.3% per year. Harbor City bonds would yield 1 to 5% per month. These rates result in you having absolutely unbelievable amounts of money if they were true, and were just not sustainable. Starting in 2018, Harbor City started advertising these bonds as low risk because they were secured, and even sometimes arguing that it was the same as going to a bank and buying a certificate of deposit. It was not. Now, if you're unaware, a secured debt is one where you have collateral that helps cover the value for the debt. A mortgage is a type of secured debt. The money extended to you is secured by the value of the home itself. If you were to find yourself unable to pay your mortgage, your bank is able to take your house, and they are less likely to lose money on the loan because of that. 2008 proved that if the house ends up worth way less than the bank thinks, then there can still end up being problems. But a mortgage is a far safer debt than an unsecured debt like a credit card. These debts were supposedly secured by, and this nonsense is a quote, so you cannot blame me for it, bonds are 100% secured by a cash asset-backed instrument issued by a major top-tiered bank which ensures return of principal. This was just a flat-out lie meant to confuse investors. The supposed business model of Harbor City Capital was investors give Harbor City Capital money. Harbor City gives this money to their other companies who used it to identify marketing leads. These leads are then sold to a bunch of businesses for a profit. Harbor City then uses that profit to pay their investors back, their initial principal, plus these crazy high rates of interest. This gets us into what were Harbor City's other businesses. One example would be Quality Click Control. Quality Click Control was a Harbor City company that claimed they could track all the profit for affiliate marketers and multi-level marketers and show their click-through rates on different ad campaigns and allow them to sell their traffic to other sites and a bunch of other really questionable advertising practices. And perhaps most notably here, their target market appears to be MLMs, multi-level marketing schemes, which you may know as those things that form a pyramid structure when you describe their business model, but that technically include products so they avoid getting in trouble for running a pyramid scheme. You've probably heard of them. Amway, Herbalife, the classics. The MLM link here gives me some idea about who was willing to pay for the leads they were generating. Another example of a Jason Benoit company, which seems related, is one called Unsubscribe Instantly that claims if you enter your email, they will help you unsubscribe from newsletters. Now, I do not know for sure, but I am also absolutely convinced that this absolutely does not work. And I think they were using this to try to get people's emails. I don't know that, of course, but there's no way that just entering your email somewhere would result in you being unsubscribed. That would require you giving this site access to your email account, which would be a bad idea. I tried to watch the video they have on their site that was supposed to explain how this works, but for some reason that video's been made private and cannot easily be viewed anymore. Isn't that weird? This Ponzi scheme makes all these crazy claims, and at least some of the top execs are skimming off the top as it goes. Anthony Devolder, or maybe George Devolder, or you know him as George Santos, those are his other names of course, joins this company in January 2020 and works there through March 2021, specifically as the regional director of the New York City office. He was described by JP Maroney, the CEO of Harbor City Capital, as a perfect fit. Now, I previously indicated that I did not believe that Santos could not have known what was going on here. Santos said, "I'm actually Harbor City Capital's head guy for New York City."
Now, right before you decided to go into politics, what were you doing?
Well, I still actually, up until August 1st, when I initiated my leave of absence, I'm the regional director for Harbor City Capital. We're a fixed income shop. We are we're within the Fortune 500 private equity firms globally. I manage all of our fixed income assets with arbitrage here in New York. I'm actually Harbor City Capital head guy for New York City. We're based out of Melbourne, Florida. And I've been with the company now a little under a year. Prior to that, I've done my tour, I'd say, of due diligence through Wall Street, Goldman, JP Morgan, so on and so forth. So this is, I'm still currently employed, just on leave, so I can pursue the race.
Which would seem to suggest he was pretty senior and should have a deep understanding of how these products he was selling worked. We also previously mentioned the Devolder Organization, Red Strategies USA. The registered agent for these is D&D International Investment Services, which is Dr. Devon Dames' company. Devon Dames is the former chief financial officer of Harbor City Capital. That would be the person who signed off on all of their financial statements. And so if anyone should have known that Harbor City Capital was a Ponzi scheme, then it would be Devon. And George/Anthony is still happy to work with them across all of these different companies. Furthermore, D&D/Devon is also a member of Red Strategies USA, which you'll remember is a company that the Devolder Organization is a member of. Jason Benoit, who we mentioned is the other manager for Redstone Strategies and behind a bunch of the other Harbor City companies, was the chief technical officer for Harbor City Capital. Jason's company, Jason Benoit Associates, is also a member of Red Strategies USA. Also a member of Red Strategies USA is Paul Nicolini, who is the regional director of the investment professionals division of Harbor City. Also a member of Red Strategies USA is Red Strategies Video, which has only a single person behind it, one Jesse McMinn, who was the senior videographer for Harbor City. So George/Anthony, who was a perfect fit, was the head guy for New York City and is still willing to work with the videographer, another regional director, the CTO, and the CFO of this alleged Ponzi scheme. George Santos is still actively working with the chief financial officer of an alleged Ponzi scheme that involved millions of dollars in embezzling. Listen, I cannot prove the biggest liar in Congress was lying about never realizing this was a Ponzi scheme. I can only show he's still perfectly happy to hang out with people who should have known. So why did we spend so much time on this little diversion about Harbor City? Well, you see, while George/Anthony was working at Harbor City, he also committed some non-Ponzi related crimes. Allegedly, of course. While employed for this investment firm, George Santos applied for unemployment in New York State and received it for months. Now, perhaps the U.S. government just doesn't understand is that George Devolder was the one working for the investment firm, and George Santos was the one who was unemployed, and Anthony Devolder was the one speaking at events in New York. So, can George Santos really be held responsible for things that George Devolder did? Better figure that one out, prosecutors. Santos supposedly received about $25,000 in unemployment benefits, and thanks to that, he is now indicted for theft of public money. What makes this particularly funny, or perhaps ominous, is that Santos is the co-sponsor of the Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act, which provided a new incentive for states to go after people who fraudulently received unemployment benefits, with the states allowed to keep 25% of the funds they're able to recoup. Santos co-sponsored a bill that strengthens the incentive to go after criminals who committed a crime that he allegedly committed. In both his failed 2020 and successful 2022 election, George was required to file financial disclosure forms. These forms get weird. For the 2020 form, he said he made $55,000 from company number 2. Apparently, he actually received only $27,555 from company 2 and $25,403 from Harbor City. You may notice that if you put those two numbers together, it gets close to the $55,000 he's reporting. It seems that for some reason, he did not want to include Harbor City on that disclosure form. The far stranger disclosure was the 2022 disclosure. On this one, he claimed that he made $750,000 in salary from the Devolder Organization, along with dividends from the Devolder Organization, somewhere between $1 million and $5 million. That's a lot of money that showed up at his company right after he worked at a Ponzi scheme, isn't it? I think it is. Oh, and let me add that the prosecutors allege that actually he did not get money from the Devolder Organization, and there's no deposits or anything in his account that matches those amounts. This disclosure of sudden and massive wealth also failed to include the money he actually did earn, including $28,000 from Harbor City and $20,000 from New York State. Want to know what makes this even weirder? There was about $700,000 in loans from George Santos to his campaign that he indicated were self-funded. Even weirder than that, in a later amendment, he changed the disclosure and no longer said those loans were from him. What the hell is going on here? I honestly do not know. I have the same feeling I did when I was covering organic fresh coin. There is absolutely a scheme here that absolutely seems political, but where I cannot put all the pieces together. Now, in this specific case, I think we're going to see some more of these pieces come together. There is an implication throughout Santos's career and this indictment of further criminality, and I expect unless Santos takes a plea soon, there will be further superseding indictments with more accusations contained in them. However, that's not really why I want to talk about Santos. I want to talk about George because of what he represents. Santos has indicated that he does not intend to resign and does intend to run for re-election. There's a Democratic-led effort to oust him, but it is encountering resistance from the GOP. The current Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, has indicated that he will not call on George Santos to resign until he's found guilty, and House Majority Leader Steve Scalise has suggested we need to wait for the legal process to resolve itself. This leads us to an interesting question as to why these individuals are not defecting from Santos, who seems increasingly toxic politically. Santos won in a district that Biden won. It's a swing district and could easily swing back if there was a special election, especially with a whole bunch of publicity about George Santos's failures. They need Santos to continue to vote in favor of their policies, and this has been especially clear lately. Slate discussed an example from the recent attempt to raise the debt limit, where Santos waited to be the final vote, sealing passage at 217 to 215. If Santos had decided for some chaotic reason to vote against it, it would have been deadlocked. Santos could literally shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, and Kevin McCarthy would probably not be willing to call on him to resign, because that would threaten McCarthy's hold on power. And as we saw during the Speaker debacle, Kevin McCarthy really wants to hold power. Santos is still in Congress because people are trying to hold on to power. This interacts with something I've talked about in some of my past videos. Like I said in my Fox News is Lying video, the GOP has tied themselves to Trump, and Trump's volatility makes it more challenging for them to extricate themselves. In my video about Rod Blagojevich going on Fox News, I talked about how using this very corrupt former governor helped Tucker Carlson and Fox provide cover for the corrupt individual they have tied themselves to in Donald Trump. By pretending Rod's prosecution was a political prosecution, they are able to better pretend that Trump's is a political prosecution. As a byproduct of these stances they've contorted themselves into in order to maintain that these prosecutions are political, they have provided Santos the cover to pretend that his prosecution is political. If they turn on Santos, then Santos will immediately start using the same language they used to defend Trump, and that puts them politically in a more challenging position. So Santos won't resign because he has no shame, and staying here keeps his face in the news, gives him connections, and those are valuable for him. GOP leadership can't really call on him to resign because it threatens their power and because it would highlight the core hypocrisy in their party. This is also why the GOP is so hesitant to condemn many of the worst elements of the party. You cannot endorse Donald Trump and tell Santos to resign. You cannot suggest Donald Trump has a well-thought-through set of policies and say Marjorie Taylor Greene is a conspiracy theorist. You cannot chastise Lauren Boebert and then suggest that Trump has the temperament to be the man in charge of our nuclear arsenal. The GOP has committed themselves to saying that Trump should be the president, that his policies are good, and that he has an appropriate temperament to control our nuclear arsenal. So they are in this position where they cannot effectively govern their own party because Trump is fundamentally ungovernable. The GOP was able to survive the never-Trumper exit of 2016 by tying themselves even stronger to Trump. But they are now inextricably linked, which means they must welcome new members who lead by Trumpism. This fundamental inability to deal with Trump is the conditions that enable George Santos, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and the rest of the idiots in the Congress right now currently making up the GOP to continue to do this type of deeply objectionable stuff. There's potentially, I think, a path for the GOP to separate from Trumpism, but it would almost certainly involve releasing any power they have now and a long process of rebuilding. And they are fundamentally unwilling to do that. And in some sense, can't do that. So the GOP is not going to deviate from that path, at least not until Trump is no longer a factor. And so they have now committed to either continuing to try to destroy democracy, to hold on to their power, or fade into obscurity as they desperately cling to ever-shrinking interest groups and more conspiratorial politics. I am glad that some of Donald Trump's crimes are being investigated. I'm glad that George Santos has been indicted for much of the same reason that I am glad that Democrat Rod Blagojevich was indicted and sentenced. We need to have consequences for wanton abuse of our system, and these individuals enjoy abusing our system. If you enjoyed this video, then consider checking out some of my other videos on politics, and thank you for your time.